This podcast is brought to you by PLI, the Practicing Law Institute, committed to providing essential legal resources to the law school community. For more information, visit pli.edu/law school.
Hello, everyone. I'm Anastasia Boyko, and I am the host of PLI's How to Navigate Law School podcast. How to Navigate Law School is your podcast guide to unlocking the hidden knowledge and practical skills needed to succeed in law school. We connect students with valuable insights from experienced professionals, decompress law school's unwritten rules, and create a supportive community empowering students to confidently create their future. Hello and welcome to PLI's How to Navigate Law School. I am your host, Anastasia Boyko, and today I have with me guest Erika Buell. Erika is an attorney, having spent time in law practice, in-house practice, was a clinical professor at Duke Law, and ran the Duke Law and Entrepreneurship Clinic program. Today, we're going to talk about experiential learning. A lot of law schools have opportunity for this. There is a long-term challenge around the doctrinal pieces and the application pieces of law school. There is a theory-practice divide that is often spoken about, and there is plenty of conversation about ready lawyers once they graduate. So today, Erika, we're going to talk about experiential learning. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me, especially for having me on a topic that is incredibly important. Say at the outset, these are my views alone, not views of any institution that I'm affiliated with now or in the past. So experiential learning is absolutely a critical piece of the law school experience. And you often, as you alluded to in the beginning, you often hear people say, well, but doctrinal classes are so much more important and the theory is so much more important. And there's the doctrinal classes, but it's not an either or. It's like improv. It's doctrinal and experiential.
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like we oftentimes have unnecessary competition within law school and within the law practice. It's either or, right? I think it's interesting that in our profession, we don't have enough space for nuance. And oftentimes when I'm talking to doctrinal faculty, I remind them, right, that to understand the law, you need the foundation of the doctrinal theory. Like students need to understand this, and then they layer on top of that the experiential pieces so they know how it applies to real world scenarios. And then in my world, which is a lot of leadership development, the leadership training is really the effectiveness pieces. But it's not one of those to the discrepancy of the others. It's teaching students how to layer that cake and where does the frosting go and where do the different ingredients go. Yeah. And so as you think about it, how do you think about experiential learning fitting into that? And I think maybe a good practical question is, what is experiential learning and what does it look like inside of a law school?
Yeah. So let's say, number one, I love your cake way of thinking about things, right? You absolutely, positively have to have the critical doctrinal foundation, right? That's in part what students are supposed to be getting in 1L, right? They get the large lecture, Socratic method, case method, a lot of cases, don't really talk about the client necessarily, but that's so foundational and you cannot get to the next level without having that important foundation. So then when you get to step 2, or the second part of what I think is a full legal education, is experiential, which I think I would define as using the doctrinal knowledge that you have and applying it to a scenario. It's in context learning. And that's not to say that you don't have doctrinal classes that do some in context learning, but it's primarily that problem solving as applied. And I also really think about it as you usually have in these experiences, whether a hypothetical or a real client, right? This is where the client comes into the equation, which is absolutely an essential part of your legal education if you want to be a practicing lawyer. So And I think I'd like to just pull on that for 2 seconds. I think it used to be the case, maybe when you and I went to law school, that a lot of people went because it was great training. It's amazing analytical training. And quote unquote, you could do anything with a law degree, right? Law degree was keeping options open. And I'm curious if you would agree with this, but I think times have changed because generally people don't have $230,000 lying around, with nothing to do, no place to be used, and 3 years of their life and a lot of opportunity cost to devote to something that's just we'll see what happens, right? So I do think it's important to situate this conversation with the assumption that a law student will actually want to be a practitioner. I'm curious for your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I am one of the outliers who thought I was going to be a practitioner, didn't really enjoy the work of law school, which, in hindsight, I realized that I had a very minimal window into what a lawyer could do while I was in law school. So I didn't even know what all my options were. And I ended up Goldilocksing throughout my career and trying all the different things you could do with a JD, including practice law and everything else, right? So I'm a big proponent of, yes, a JD can be applied to a lot of different places, but I think your point around opportunity costs and other things you could do is an important one to take because it's 3 years. And depending on sort of the financial circumstances under which you go to law school, it can be a lot of pressure to be able to pay off your loans. Interestingly enough, one of my theses in law school was all about the misguided law student, how we come in with one idea of something and we graduate and do something different. And a big impetus around that is loans. And I learned that as far as back as the 70s, we were writing about loan pressure being a factor and consideration for career paths out of law school. So I try to hesitate to tell people you can do anything you want out of law school. I think there's an asterisk based on your financial situation and based on your loan situation about what you can do and how much pressure you're going to feel potentially to do those things, and whether your school has repayment programs for public interest or certain, salary thresholds for repayment. So it's just really important to look at your career in context of that as you're making a big choice. And I was 20 when I was applying to law school, or 21, and I felt like I didn't really understand some of the decisions I was making at that age. So it's important to right-size that for yourself. We have seen a huge uptick in law school application numbers this year, which I think does trend with economic anxiety. But I think a lot of folks are seeing what they're seeing in the ecosystem and wanting to understand the law better, in addition to build up the kind of skills that law school offers.
Yes, and I didn't have any really lawyers in my family. So when I was going to law school, I had done 2 years before law school as a paralegal. So I had a little bit of a concept. You're right that there are many different paths that you can take. And one of the things that I think experiential learning can help students do is to learn a little bit about what practice would look like in an in-house counsel type role, what practice would look like in a public interest type of role. And then, obviously a law firm role too could be very different, whether it's big law or solo practitioner or medium-sized firm, et cetera.
I'll jump in and add that, there's a big difference between learning ideas around a concept like intellectual property and seeing what kinds of things an intellectual property lawyer might do day to day. So you might find the ideas interesting, especially if you're a smart person, which is people who go to law school, right, are generally very smart, like to learn. And so if you're a curious person, you're going to have a lot of interests. And so trying to decide what the day-to-day looks like in a particular practice might look very different than the concepts of reading about it in the newspaper or scholarly articles.
100%. And I think externships especially can be really impactful in that way.
Yeah, and looking at different practice areas. So I'd love for you to tell us about the program that you are working on at Duke. My understanding is there aren't a lot of entrepreneurship programs or even transactional clinics across the legal education spectrum. So I think those are becoming more popular. There's a lot more interest from students in those. My understanding is oftentimes clinical programs are very litigation focused and sort of direct client in that sense.
Oh, you're absolutely right. Well, so just to pull on that litigation focus for a bit, I mean, most of the 1L curriculum, right, is pretty standard and it's pretty heavy duty litigation based. When you are in contracts, which is one that is more transactional, most, or certainly when I went to law school, we didn't even look at a contract in contracts, right? We spent a ton of time talking about consideration, talking about pregnant cows, and, which is all important for the foundation of understanding how to think about contracts and how to analyze them and how we think about law as it is applied to contracts. But one thing that is really helpful is when you start to move into the courses that if you came to law school to be a transactional lawyer, you're going to be really psyched when you get to take business associations. So one of the things I was in helping to develop the curriculum for, I did not develop the branding for this, for the JD-LLM-LE, right? So it's an LLM, a Master of Laws, in law and entrepreneurship, in addition to the JD. So it's basically a next generation JD MBA with a focus on entrepreneurship. So one of the things that we did was brought business associations into the 1L curriculum, tacked on right after 1L ends. I would teach an experiential course, right? A simulation course called Advising the Entrepreneurial Client, which would basically help students to learn about how one represents a startup company from the idea that was created by the founders to incorporation of the entity. And we covered tax, we covered some securities regulation. We did role playing, which I think is a ton of fun for the students. To situate them and like, okay, let's imagine you've learned all this stuff in business associations. Now you're going to actually incorporate an entity. What are the choices you make? How do you talk to the founders about that? And so it helps to contextualize what they learned in business associations. So from there, would you like me to tell you more about?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think like as you're
do?
talking, one of the things that, as we put together this podcast, a lot of what we're trying to do is break down the complexity of law school and give students some practical tips. I do think navigating law school very much feels like a black box, and your entry point is informed by your own background. I was also a first-gen professional lawyer, right? So I worked within law firms and I've worked around lawyers, but I didn't grow up with it and I didn't have a lot of exposure to the day-to-day of what that looks like. And so my viewpoint was informed by that. My viewpoint was informed by being a refugee and also being someone who, had held beliefs and viewpoints on government and society that were different than the state that I grew up in, right? So like my views of governments and systems and politics shaped a lot of what brought me to law school. And so when I got here trying to navigate what I do with this degree and what lawyers do was really a pulling up to 30,000 feet and realizing that what I'd seen on TV, especially litigators in a courtroom, is one small fraction of what lawyers can and do. And so part of, I think, what we're trying to explain for students is how do they get that context? And I do think experiential learning is a big piece of that, trying out different pieces. So maybe it would be good to learn, like, what aha moments did students have? What aha moments did you have within the entrepreneurship program and the clinical experience while you were at Duke?
Well, one thing that I would like to offer to your audience, because I think it was helpful for me when someone explained it this way, because I didn't have lawyers in my family. Litigation is backward looking, and it tends to be kind of fixed pie, right? People are arguing about a pot of money or that there was something that happened that was a wrong that was done, and we need to remedy that. It's backward looking and combative, really. When you're thinking about transactional lawyering, this is not to say that there's only litigation and transaction, right? There's lots of other stuff too. But broad brush, transactional is trying to help two parties, at least, come together so that both of them will be better off through this transaction, right? Through whatever you do. So it could be even as simple as people understand buying a house, right? So if you're buying a house, maybe you're buying a company. And so we think about the coming together of the two parties and being absolutely a zealous advocate for your client, but in a way that they come together, right? So this is also where negotiation is so critical, and thinking about how we can possibly grow the pie, right? How we can find and create more value is one thing that I think is helpful for students.
Yeah, I love that. I talk to so many students who follow the litigation path because that's the sort of what seems really appealing and what their classmates are doing. And some of them confide and say, I really don't like the combative nature of this. It's very stressful. This is not how I want to help resolve problems. And it doesn't mean that one is, to your point, better than the other, but it's just so important to know yourself and what role you want to be in as a helper. Like, lawyers are helpers in society. We help to resolve disputes. We help to create things, right? We're advisors and stewards for people. And so to understand for yourself where you want to be, I think that also speaks to, like, who do you want your client to be? Do you want to help individuals who are facing criminal or civil issues? Do you want to help companies? Do you want to work with a large company versus a small company? I find that many students who I've spoken to who've had the benefit of an entrepreneurship like Experiential clinic say how fun it is, right, to help build something with startup clients and what that looks like. So I'd love to dive in a little bit about skill building, right? Clinics and experiential learning allow us to build skills that don't traditionally live in the doctrinal experience. So can we talk about some of those maybe?
Sure, I'd be happy to. In preparing for this, I went through a bit of what the curriculum is for the LLM LE program, trying to think about the things that were impactful.
Yeah.
And the things we had skills courses required, like deal skills, which is simulation, negotiation, which I highly recommend for every law student, because negotiating as a lawyer is a little different than just negotiation in a business school context.
I would tell everybody to take a negotiation class, that and an accounting class. That's the feedback we got from a lot of our alumni when we were building the leadership program. But with negotiation, the class we had at Yale was business school students with law school students. And so it was a fun joint class. And the professor would comment about how interesting it was, right? Like how differently both mindsets approach negotiation.
Yes. And it's also really great if you can take, when I graduated from NYU, I took some classes at their business school just to see it's just a different vibe altogether in the way that they approach it. One of the things that the students get to choose from is they have a guaranteed spot in the Startup Ventures Clinic where they're actually working with founders and they're helping them incorporate, et cetera, et cetera. You asked about skills, but I do think this is an important piece is the students can choose from either doing a clinic, which is for these folks, it's a Startup Ventures Clinic or Community Enterprise, which is basically nonprofits, or they can do an externship or practicum. Those are basically the same thing. And some of the ones that we did, the programs that I was most proud of was we had a strong relationship with what is now called Duke Capital Partners. It used to be the Duke Angel Network. And in essence, law students would work with capital partners to source and evaluate and present angel investments from a business perspective. Legal came into it too, but they were working with MBA students, PhD students, sometimes MDs. And so you had this great mix of people who brought different insights to the conversation. And that type of learning, that type of understanding, oh, the engineer thinks this way about something, is super helpful and impactful, because when you get to practice, let's say you're working with, let's say you're in-house counsel, you're going to be working with sales folks usually. Sales folks think very differently about the world than lawyers do. So being able to have those windows into, oh, here's where my legal analysis is really helpful and can be useful. And then here's where somebody else's insights can really help in whatever project we're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, I find that to be such an important point to underscore, is understanding your client's needs. One of my Yale professors would say that you come to law school and you really learn how to narrow in on the problem. And we sort of leave you here, right? And maybe if you get into a clinic, you'll start to apply it and broaden out. And that's where your skills are actually valuable, is learning how to take those principles around the law and apply them to real world situations. And you may not even need to address the problem fully with the law, right? It's understanding what are the outcomes that your client wants. What are the legal issues at play? How do you help mitigate risk? But if you don't have opportunities to apply this in real world scenarios to resolve conflict, which may or may not require use of the law, you will very much get stuck at that narrowness point, and you won't be as effective of an advisor. And so it's important that, that they've had interactions with clients who can help them shift their vision around what kind of problem you're trying to solve, what are their pain points, what are they really asking you for, versus clients can go to anybody and ask them what the law is. Clients can go to ChatGPT and ask them what the law is. What they need is a strategic advisor who ideally has experience in their sector to guide them through a challenging issue that they need to resolve, whether it's a conflict or whether it's building something.
Yes, absolutely. I cannot emphasize enough, kind of thinking from the client's perspective is so important. And also, don't forget the non-legal answer, right? Often students in the Startup Ventures Clinic will be talking with a founder about how to use a non-disclosure agreement. So this is very basic contract that two entities that want to have preliminary business discussions where they want to share information that they don't want the other party to either disclose or use for any purpose other than seeing if they want to do a deal together.
Yep.
We talk about this actually in the class that I was doing in a hypothetical with, well, okay, how do you're explaining to them what this thing does, but why do they want this piece of paper, right? They don't actually want to sue anyone, right? They don't have money to sue somebody. They want to spend and if the money they do have, they want to grow their business. So then you also come back to the human part of trust your gut. Someone's making you feel hinky and you feel like they're going to play fast and loose with your information, maybe hold off.
Yeah.
Right? So it kind of, experiential learning helps take you. It's almost like you've gone through the birth canal of 1L, right?
Yeah.
And then now you're coming out and you're saying, hello world, let's now take what we've learned and all of this doctrinal knowledge and all this rigorous analysis and see how it really works in context with humans.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. One other skill that I think is super important from an experiential perspective that I've heard and experienced is also teamwork. I feel like much of law school is an individual contributor sport. And there's a lot of competition, especially with schools who have more traditional grade rubrics. And so I'd love to chat a little bit about what are the team building skills that get built in experiential learning, as well as why those are important for professional practice.
Team building, problem solving, client interviewing. I mean, I made a list for myself of all of there's so many things that you can learn in an experiential setting. But the group work, I personally tried to build that, or I did build that into my course. And I, in fact, had the students fill out a questionnaire that basically told me how comfortable they were with, for example, Excel and some other things. And formed them into groups without asking them whether they wanted to be in the groups with, with those people, because that's what happens in the real world.
It does. It's very hard to avoid group projects. And
Yes.
even if you're in a firm and you've been given discrete tasks, you will oftentimes find yourself on a deal team or, a litigation group, and you don't get to choose those people, just like your family. And so you need to learn how you're going to go toward a similar goal together when your approaches are different, your experience is different, your attitudes are different. And that is a very much learned, quote unquote, soft skill, but one of the hardest things you're going to need to master as a legal professional.
Absolutely. And I think that was there's a paper that's about the Harvard Law School's employers weigh in on what skills they wanted their folks to have and what courses to take. And negotiation skills was one, and work is so important. And I would even add on to that, when you're in a clinic situation, as opposed to an experiential class, you also have, you're basically in a little mini law firm. And there's also the person who, answers the phone for the clinic generally, and who might help with making copies or whatever, right? Like, it takes a whole bunch of people doing a whole bunch of different jobs, and you're all working together as a team. So I always try and impress upon students that it's not just the lawyers, right? There's a whole ecosystem of people that we all need to work together in order to get the client the result that they need.
I feel like there's so many invisible folks within a large organization who, without them, the work wouldn't get done, right? They may not have the same kind of public profile, but those folks are oftentimes the most necessary members of the team. And you need to acknowledge everyone who's part of that with you, because they keep all the different facets of it running. So before we pivot to sort of careers and alumni relationships vis-a-vis experiential learning, are there any other points you want to address for skills and why clinics are important?
I think one of the main benefits of a clinic, in addition to contextualizing what you've learned doctrinally, right, is it helps you, I think we touched upon this a little bit, it helps you figure out what you really want to do as a lawyer, where you really want to be. So an example here is a student did the clinic, and she came back and she said, she spent her whole time like wanting to do this clinic, getting really psyched about it. And then she sort of said, yeah, but I really didn't enjoy telling the founders again and again, like, stuff they didn't know. Right, which is in essence teaching founders. And so we reflected about that and said, okay, so what about maybe exploring representing the investors? What would that look like, right? Those people tend not to, they're repeat players, so they don't need the teaching aspects of startup law, which was kind of an aha for me as well. It's like, oh, of course I love to be an educator. I love teaching. I do that both in a classroom and also in my law practice. And that's something that's a value for me. That's something I absolutely love. And so I can seek to do more of that. So it's helpful to learn more about yourself as you move through these experiences. And obviously, for folks who go straight through from undergrad to law school, that is super, super impactful and valuable. If you've worked for 10 years, say, and you've gone back to school as a second career, gone back to law school as a second career, that may be less impactful, but you're still going to learn a ton no matter what clinic you do.
Yeah, and I'd want students to take that as a learning as well. It's just as important, if not more important, to learn what you don't want to do than what you do want to do. Sometimes it is a process of elimination. I remember doing an externship in law school around drug policy with the ACLU. I was really passionate about this topic, but the work itself wasn't what I enjoyed doing, right? So it really helped me figure out, okay, I don't necessarily want to be in the nonprofit space, and I don't necessarily want to be working on this issue as a day-to-day lawyer for a variety of reasons. And so now I can pivot and focus on the kinds of things I want to do. And so I think it ends up being a really helpful iterative experience around career pathing. And so I'd love to pivot into that piece. The great thing about experiential learning is you get to work with more lawyers, right? And especially folks like yourself who have had a lot of practical experience. And how do you want students to think about career pathing and maybe finding opportunities for future externships or future work after graduating as an extension, right, of some of their experiential work, right? Are they building relationships with potential employers? Are they thinking about creating a good network of alumni? Is there a way to contextualize that piece for them as well?
Yeah, I think it makes sense to talk about sort of how to choose a clinic,
Yep,
right?
perfect.
And for me, I think about a lot of law school classes this way of sort of the professor, passion, or path, right? So if you can get 2 out of 3, I mean, you get 3 out of 3, great. But if meaning, number one, the professor, so it taught by someone who kind of is aligned with what you want from an experience, right? So if it's an externship, is the supervisor going to be someone who's really going to invest in you and your growth and your educational experience, potentially also, could be helpful later on as a practitioner? Do you have a super passion for the project? Just like you said, you just feel like, I want to work on a criminal justice clinic, notwithstanding the fact that I'm going to go into patent law, just because I want to have that experience. So that's certainly another piece of it. And then the third path is more of what we have been talking about, which is figuring out what you don't like, what you do like. Maybe you want to develop your oral advocacy skills, or want to just try a new area. You can path piece, learn a lot about yourself, and also hopefully build relationships with alums who may be working with the clinic in various ways that helps to create more of a network. But this reminds me, coming back to the sort of how do you figure out what to take and how to make sense of all of this stuff? One thing that was really helpful for the program that developed and that I directed was that we structurally had the 3 Ls come and talk to the 2 Ls, and the 2 Ls come and talk to the 1 Ls. And then in the broader ecosystem, we also had alums come and talk to, all 3 of the years, just to give a sense of community. And to, we also have Google Docs for how to think about whether to do a clerkship, how to think about choosing a clinic, how to think about what to do your first summer, et cetera. And that community piece, the community is more and more important. We all get so busy with everything that we're doing. It's being able to find the people who will be your champions and will be your advocates and who help you learn and continue learning and growing through your career. That's what I think is really most impactful for students when that happens.
Yeah, and having points of contact, right? So I think many law schools will have alumni databases, but without an initial contact there or fully understanding somebody's career, it's harder to reach out to those people or make a substantive connection with them when you're seeking advice around a particular issue. And so one of the things that I found helpful, both in Goldilocksing my own career, but also advising law students, is there are people out there who have faced similar challenges as you, right? You're not the first person navigating some of these pivots that you're thinking about or some of these sort of forks in the road. And so to the extent that you can find someone who has had a similar life experience or is facing a similar question, they've done a lot of this legwork to help you get insight and context about doing your own, right? So it's so important to not have to reinvent the wheel as you are charting your career inside and outside of law school. And I found that many folks who are involved with experiential education, clinical programs, centers, those folks have had a variety of life experiences, right? Just like yourself. And so you can walk students through some of those pivots and help them at least think about how to frame their decision-making and the questions that they're asking. And I'd love to sort of wrap us up with that question, which is, what advice would you have for your former law school self, both in context of the things we've discussed or maybe even a broader one?
Oh my gosh, what you just said is so insightful. But one of the things I would add to it, what would I tell my law school self, was I really didn't appreciate the extent to which, I think this is not always true, but people will say law school doesn't teach you how to be a lawyer, right? And that I couldn't conceptualize that. So I think one of the reasons why, I think that's changed a lot more recently, but one of the things that I loved about teaching was teaching what I wish someone had taught me. Right. So, but I will say with your comment about don't reinvent the wheel, absolutely. The other thing is keep loose connections with people. You don't have to be BFFs with them, right? You can just keep loose connections because these questions or decision points will come up at various points during your career. And it doesn't necessarily do you a ton of good to have some advice given to you in law school that you weren't really ready to apply or you didn't really need, right? It's the teacher emerges when, the student is ready. So I guess I would say this is just a continual process. And then to come back to overall, there are many successful paths. There are many ways to navigate law school, a legal career. The best path is the path that is yours. And so I absolutely agree with you about connecting with people and not reinventing the wheel. I also think it's important to do a gut check and take their view, myself included, right?
Yeah.
I come from a particular background. I'm a particular type of person. I, came up at a particular time, right? These things all move and shift. So knowing yourself and your values and kind of thinking with a lens of filtering what the advice that folks give you, gut checking it for yourself, I think is 100%. Never a bad idea.
Yeah. Careers are long, right? And people are going to give you a lot of 100%. Advice, and you need to think about it in the context of your own path. And oftentimes, I think the biggest mistake I made in law school and many others did, and I did along my career, was trying to optimize for my future self. And you're going to be in different chapters. You're going to have different needs across your life and your career. And the more folks you can soundboard around this with, more perspectives you can have, the less rigid you can be, right, around your path, the better off you will be. And so I feel like experiential learning is a key component of that exercise and journey in law school because it allows you to iterate and apply different concepts and test out what you like and what you don't like. So I'm really grateful that you joined us for this discussion, and we'll pin some of the resources that we talked about in the show notes. But I appreciate you, Erika, and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. This is a great discussion.
Thanks for listening to How to Navigate Law School, the podcast dedicated to guiding you through the hidden rules and practical skills essential for success in law school. For additional resources, visit PLI's Law School Hub at pli.edu/law school. Please note that the views and opinions expressed during this podcast represent those of the individuals being interviewed and not necessarily those of PLI. PLI is a nonprofit learning organization dedicated to keeping attorneys and other professionals at the forefront of knowledge and expertise.